Thank you all very much for your hospitality and for welcoming myself and Osiris and Desiree. I said, why don't you bring Desiree? It'll be kind of a Tucson honeymoon or something. So that's what it was. I'm very honored to be able to support the St. Francis Shelter. So thank you all for being here to help them continue to thrive. They're so an important presence in this city. So we're still in Lent, and Lent always reminds me of this homegirl named Michelle Nunez, who worked at Homeboy for a time. And she lived and grew up in the projects, and she came to my office once and she said, well, it's official. I found out my man's been cheating on me. I said, oh gosh, I'm sorry to hear that. And she goes, I don't sweat it. I just went to church, got me them ashes, gave his ass up for Lent. That has nothing to do with what I'm going to say to you, but it's my favorite Lenten story, and that's all I'm going to say about Lent, except, repent is a word that we hear, and repent means to move beyond the mind you have, which is kind of what we're supposed to do. It's not about giving stuff up, it's about giving into the God who loves us without measure and without regret. It's about allowing love to live through us. And so in order to do that, we kind of have to move beyond the mind we have. Because we want to do something very concrete, which is what St. Francis Shelter stands for, which is basically a community of kinship such that God might recognize it. We want to create more and more and nurture and help flourish a community of cherished belonging. This is God's dream come true. Or as Jesus puts it, that you may be one. He's talking about kinship. And to that end, we stand at the margins because that's the only way they'll ever get erased, is if we stand out at them. And we stand with the poor and the powerless and the voiceless, and we stand with those whose dignity has been denied, and we stand with those whose burdens are more than they can bear. And every once in a while we have this extraordinary privilege to be able to stand with the easily despised and the readily left out. We get to stand with the demonized so that the demonizing will stop, and we stand with the disposable so that the day will come when we stop throwing people away. And so we seek this community of kinship where there is no us and them, there's just us, and we remember that Mother Teresa diagnosed the world's ills correctly when she suggested that the problem in the world is that we've just forgotten that we belong to each other. So how do we stand against forgetting that? And so we brace ourselves as we inch our way out to the margins, because the world will accuse us of wasting our time. But the prophet Jeremiah writes, for in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing. We go to the margins and other voices suddenly get heard. Well, none of that makes any sense at all, I don't think, except for the notion of God to which we are all invited. And in order to do that, you have to unlearn some things. I do anyway. I'll speak for myself. That you have to unlearn a kind of an old, tired, weary spiritual language that sometimes can block the pores of our soul and fail to aerate our spirits. And so you want to move to a spacious and expansive God, because our God can grow kind of puny. I remember years ago I had a spiritual director who said to me, you know, we need a better God than the one we have. He was a Jesuit. But of course he's right, you know, because, you know, our God is sometimes can be puny if we're not careful and petty. Meister Eckhart, who was a mystic and a priest who died in 1328, I think, and you're Googling him now, I know, so just to prove me wrong, but he used to say, it is a lie, any talk of God that doesn't comfort us. And of course that's true, and of course we don't believe it, because we need to move beyond the mind we have. And that's kind of essential. Otherwise, we end up, you know, creating God in our own image instead of the other way around. Or as my friend Andy Lamott always says, you know you've created God in your own image when God hates the same people you do. But you want to avoid that at all costs, you know. I remember years ago I was saying Mass at San Fernando Juvenile Hall, and it was a big gym, and about 500 gang members were there. And I was vested presiding. I had a owl and a stole, and I was sitting up on a little raised platform on a little folding chair, and over on this side was the podium where the kids would, the homies would come up and do the readings. And so the first guy got up and did the Old Testament reading on a Sunday. And then the second guy got up to do the responsorial psalm. And I had these sheets, you know, that had the readings in English and in Spanish. And I thought, well, I'm going to listen to the word proclaimed. And I was having it rest on my lap. And this kid to do the responsorial psalm, I don't know, there was like a overabundance of confidence in his voice. And he gets up and he says, the Lord is exhausted. And I look at the sheet, what the hell? And it was, the Lord is exalted. And I remember thinking to myself, why, that's way better. Because the exalted God, if we're honest, is kind of a human creation. You know, if any of us were God, we would want to be exalted, you know, and so we kind of project that onto God. But the exhausted God really makes more sense. You know, a lot of you, I'm sure you might have that experience where somebody says, how was your weekend? And you go, oh my God, I'm exhausted, I'm pooped. You know, the grandkids came over and, well, you know, it's a good tired, but you know what exhausted means. It means extending of yourself to another person. That's where the joy is. And that is better, actually. You know, as a product of COVID and stuff, everybody, you know, Zoom, and I have 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and so we would Zoom once a month, you know, and recently it was the anniversary of my mom's death, and we were all, there were 8 of us with all their spouses, you know, and so my mom died, I guess it was, my touchstone was, it was towards the end of the first year of the Trump administration, and I don't know why I remember that, but that was the case. And she died the way, you know, all of us want to die, in your own home, in your own bed, surrounded by your kids. She was 92. And she was sharp as a tack even till the end. In fact, in the last year of her life, she watched so much MSNBC, she was becoming Rachel Maddow. And she was not a lick afraid of dying. I mean, in fact, about a month before she died, she said to me, she was just giddy and exhilarated, and she said, "I've never done this before." Which is something you say just before you skydive, So, in fact, the day before she died, I was sitting at the foot of her bed, and she was asleep, and this never happened. I was alone in the room with her. Never happened. And she was sleeping, and she woke up and she saw me sitting there, and she went, "Oh, for crying out loud," and she went back to sleep. Well, she was pissed off that she hadn't died, Sorry. Well, the next day, again, it was really odd. I was alone, and that just never happened. And a couple of my sisters, I think, went out to get lunch or something, and at exactly noon, she lifted her head from the pillow, and she opened her eyes, and she let out this wondrous, glorious gasp. Skydiving. And she left us. And nobody in earshot of the sound could ever be afraid of death again. But I remember in the last days of her life, she'd be in and out of consciousness, and there'd be 4 of us or 8 of us around her bed. And she would come to, and she'd lock on to one of us with a laser beam focus, and she would say with breathless delight, "You're here. You're here." And I remembered that when we buried her, and I thought, that may well be the singular agenda item of our exhausted God, to look at you with breathless delight and simply say, "You're here. You're here." In fact, we have this whole mythic thing about Jesus in the desert for the 40 days, which is the precursor to our Lent. And we have this notion of grumbling stomach and dark night of the soul and temptations. And Jesus wondering, should I have given up both scotch and chocolate for Lent? Like that. And when it really, I'm sure, was only this. It was God looking at Jesus and saying, "You're here. You're here." And Jesus not knowing exactly what to say back except, "You're here. You're here." And I think that's pretty much it. And I think it's important for us to remember how singular and simple the God who loves us without measure and without regret just wants to behold us. Behold the one beholding you and smiling. And so you receive the tender glance, and then you choose to become the tender glance in the world. And that is everything. At Homeboy Industries, we're 35 years old now, and we didn't start to want to do anything except to help the members of the 8 gangs that were in my parish at Dolores Mission, the poorest parish in the city, largest grouping of public housing west of the Mississippi, and a place where 8 gangs were at war with each other. And the LAPD named my parish as the place of the highest concentration of gang activity in the whole city. And now, 35 years later, we didn't intend to do this, but we've become now the largest gang intervention rehab reentry program on the planet. So 10,000. We're in our 4th location, headquarters in Chinatown, and 10,000 gang members a year wander through our doors wanting to reimagine their lives. They come through our doors barricaded behind a wall of shame and disgrace, and the only thing that can scale that wall is tenderness And so it is important to receive the tender glance of God so that you can be that tender glance in the world. You notice the notice of God so that you can become the notice of God in the world. Every one of those 10,000 who walk through our doors comes with what psychologists call a disorganized attachment. Mom was either frightened or frightening. And you can't calm yourself down if you've never been soothed. So they walk through the doors, and as the Buddhists say, "O nobly born, remember who you really are." People see them and remember who they really are. They walk in the door and somebody looks at them and says, "You're here. You're here." The homies will say, because they've been locked up for so many years, we're used to being watched, but we're not used to being seen. And so you create a safe place where folks can be seen, and then they can be cherished. If it's true, and I certainly believe it's true, that a traumatized person is likely to cause trauma, then it has to be true that a cherished person will be able to find their way to the joy there is in cherishing themselves and others. And that's the hope, that somehow we will create this place where people can feel cherished. I was talking to a woman on a Zoom the other day, and she was interviewing me, talking to me for some doctoral thesis, but her day job was she works with the unhoused. And she says, homeless people are not homeless because they run out of money. They're homeless because they run out of relationships. And I thought that's absolutely true, certainly of gang members as well. Part of the task at Homeboy is to ensure that nobody runs out of a relationship, because it is the relationship that heals. At Homeboy, we're kind of allergic to the idea of holding the bar up and asking homies to measure up. And mainly because our exhausted God never does that to us. Instead, we hold the mirror up and we tell people the truth, that they are exactly what God had in mind when God made them. And then you watch them become that truth. You watch them inhabit that truth. And no bullet can pierce it. No 4 prison walls can keep it out. And death can't touch it because it's huge. But you have to reach in and you have to dismantle the messages of shame and disgrace that get in the way, that keep people from seeing their truth. The other day I was talking to a homie named Joseph in my office, and I'd known him for a lot of years. I buried his father who died of an overdose. Joseph became a gang member like his father, a heroin addict like his father. And now he's doing well. And as the conversation finished and he stood up, he said, "You know what I think life is about? Life is about removing the blindfold," he says. And I said, "I think you're right. But what do you see when the blindfold falls?" And he puts his hand on his heart and he says, "Goodness. Only goodness." And so we stand in those two truths, that every single human being is unshakably good, no exceptions, and that we all belong to each other, no exceptions. What he said reminded me of, I was channel surfing some time ago, and I came across the Dalai Lama, who was being interviewed by BBC or something, and the woman had asked him a question, and he was repeating the question in order then to answer it. And his English is a kind of, not great, and he had subtitles. He struggles a little bit with it. You can understand him, but, and he repeats the question. He says, "What is the mark and measure of authentic religion?" And then he pauses, and he puts his hands on his chest and he says, warm-heartedness. And then he proceeds to talk about it a little bit, and the word is clunky, and it's clumsy, and its clumsiness sort of serves its purpose, and as he says it more often, it gets more clunky. Warm-heartedness. And he made a point to say that there were two kind of purposes of the warm-heartedness. One is a kind of an inner peace that anchors you. But it has to be turned out into the world, that you have to bring this warm-heartedness into the world. Tender glance, tender glance. For we are invited to be in the world who God is. Compassionate, loving, and kind. Well, I'm a Jesuit, you know, like the Pope. I'm just saying. And I just celebrated 50 years as a Jesuit, but the homies don't really know what a Jesuit is too much, you know, and even though there are 3 of us who work there now, and there are always a few of us who worked there over the last 35 years. And so there I am in my office, and my office is glass enclosed, and I can look out into the entire floor of the reception area where hundreds, every chair is filled with homies wanting to get free tattoo removal, or see a therapist, or see somebody in our legal team upstairs, to go to anger management, or see a therapist, or mainly apply for our 18-month training program. And they're all waiting. And we have visitors who come from all over the world to see Homeboy Industries. And our headquarters is quite large. Homeboy Bakery is behind my office, and then there's Homegirl Cafe and Homeboy Merchandise, and so we get a lot of tour groups, many a day, people from all over the world, and you know, groups of every imaginable size, and the homies give the tours. And so I'm sitting there behind my desk, and there are 3 people in front, and a tour group parks itself, like 20 people, right in front of my office, and it's one of those observe our founder in his natural habitat kinds of moments. And so the tour guide is Osvaldo, and Osvaldo has what the homies call a loud-ass voice, and I'm waving faintly as I'm trying to carry on this meeting, and I can hear him. He says, "This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So I kind of do some of the moves for which I am most famous. Anyway, I tell you that to tell you this, that in 1544, on February 27th, 1544, St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, enters this word for the very first time in his spiritual diary, in his journal. And then he proceeds to use this word a lot for the remaining 12 years of his life until he died. And before he died, he goes back throughout his journal and he circles this word. And I know Spanish, but I had never heard this word before. And the word is acatamiento. Acatamiento. And it comes from kind of an archaic word, acatar, which means to look at something with attention. And it gets translated as affectionate awe. Acatamiento. And certainly it was born from a mystical moment between Ignatius and his God. But he didn't want to settle for that. He wanted to hold out for a stance in the world at the margins. He didn't want to settle for a moment. He held out for a movement which identifies how we are to stand at the margins. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. Which reminds me, of course, of the Acts of the Apostles that has that one line which is quite curious that says, "And awe came upon everyone." And it suggests that the measure of health in every community, including this one, may well reside in our ability to stand in awe at what the poor have to carry, rather than stand in judgment at how they carry it. So, I remember years ago I was invited to speak to 600 social workers in Richmond, Virginia, and it was what we call a gang in-service. And so you get 600 social workers who commandeer a hotel ballroom, and they sign in and they get credits. And it's from 9 to 5, and it's breakout sessions and workshops and keynotes. And to learn about why do kids join gangs, you know, that it's about a lethal absence of hope. It's about, you know, no hopeful kid has ever joined a gang in the history of the world. And no kid is seeking anything when he joins a gang. He's always fleeing something. No exceptions. And so I had spoken at these gang in-services many times, and I, you know, I'm figuring I'd do a keynote. And I said, sure. And so I bought my ticket. Well, a week before I was to fly, I pulled the letter out, and to my horror, I discovered that I am to be the only speaker 9 to 5 all damn day. And I said to myself, as the homies say, oh hell no, I'm not going to be the only speaker. So I pulled 2 trainees in, Andre, African-American gang member, and Jose, and I sit them down in my office, and they're in our 18-month training program. They're in like their 9th month. And so I sit them down and I said, look, at the end of the week, you're flying with me to Richmond, Virginia. I'd like you to get up in front of 600 social workers and tell your stories. Take your time. Because we got a long ass day to fill. So Jose got up first, and I never heard him tell his story. And he was 25, I think, and he'd been a shot caller in prison, tattooed. At that juncture in his 9th month of the 18 months, you have phases and you move to different places in we have 11 social enterprises, for example. Bakery, restaurants. Osiris works in the diner, which is the only place you can get food at City Hall. And so at this juncture, he kind of became a very valued member of our substance abuse team, a man solid in his own recovery. And now he was helping younger homies and homegirls with their addiction issues. So not only had he been to prison and a shot caller from his gang, he had also had a long stretch as a homeless man and an even longer stretch as a heroin addict. So he gets up in front of 600 social workers and he says, I guess you could say my mom and me, we didn't get along so good. I think I was 6 when she looked at me and she said, why don't you just kill yourself? You're such a burden to me. Well, 600 social workers did what you just did. And then he said, it sounds way worser in Spanish. And then they did what you just did, you know, and we got whiplash going from gasp to laugh. But then he continued. I think I was 9 when my mom drove me down to the deepest part of Baja California, and she walked me up to an orphanage, and she knocked on the door, and the guy came to the door, and she said, I found this kid. And she left me there for 90 days until my grandmother could get out of her where she had dumped me, and my grandmother came and rescued me. My mom beat me every single day of my elementary school years with things you could imagine and a lot of things you couldn't. Every day my back was bloodied and scarred. In fact, I had to wear 3 t-shirts to school each day. First t-shirt because the blood would seep through, and the second t-shirt you could still see it. Finally, the 3rd t-shirt you couldn't see any blood. Kids at school, they make fun of me. Hey, fool, it's 100 degrees. Why are you wearing 3 t-shirts? And then he stopped speaking, so overwhelmed with emotion. And he seemed to be staring at a piece of his story that only he could see. And when he could regain his speech, he said through his tears, I wore 3 t-shirts well into my adult years because I was ashamed of my wounds. I didn't want anybody to see them. But now I welcome my wounds. I run my fingers over my scars. My wounds are my friends. After all, how can I help heal the wounded if I don't welcome my own wounds? And awe came upon everyone. Acatamiento, affectionate awe. The measure of our compassion lies not in our service of those on the margins, but only in our willingness to see ourselves in kinship with them. For the truth of the matter is this: if we don't welcome our own wounds, we may well be tempted to despise the wounded. And so we choose a stance at the margins. I was asked the other day by some wide-eyed novices. I was cooking dinner for all of the novitiate, was like 20 people and 5 of my community. And there I am stirring the polenta, and there was like 5 novices wandered into the kitchen, and one of them says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Sure." And he said, "How do you talk to people about faith?" Well, I'm stirring and making sure the chicken's not burning, and I said, "Well, I don't." All 5 of them in unison gasped, and then I kind of went, "Oh, yikes." Well, I don't, because it's about living as though the truth were true. It's about putting first things recognizably first. It's about taking seriously what Jesus took seriously. 4 things only: inclusion, nonviolence, unconditional loving kindness, compassionate acceptance. That's it. You don't talk about it, you do it. Otherwise, our faith stays stuck in our head, and its doctrine and belief system and creedal statements. And only once in a while, sometimes, does it wander into our hearts. But our faith has to find its way to our feet. And what do feet do? They stand in the right place. And once you stand there, what do? You find a stance, affectionate awe. And all of that reminds me of my friend, Bishop Dave O'Connell, who was killed in February. I had just seen him a week before, and I'd known him for 30 years, and he's the real deal. Mainly because he allowed his faith to find its way to his feet, and he stood in the right place. And his stance there was acatamiento, affectionate awe. You don't go to the margins to make a difference, because then it's about you. It can't be about you. You go to the margins so that the folks at the margins make you different. And then it's about us. I'm going to tell one last story, and then we're going to sit at this table was set up, so we're going to have to sit there. And myself and Osiris. And so come on up and say hello and talk to us. So it occurs sometimes for universities in particular to force their students to read my books against their will, you know, and I'm not complaining. But my alma mater, Gonzaga University, thank you very much, who I normally say at this point in my talk, ruin my bracket every March, but so far so good. I'm number 1 in my whole family, which I can't believe. That's never happened out of 50. And so they invited me and they said, you know, we've asked the entire freshman class to read Tattoos on the Heart. Can you come up here and, you know, and give a talk? And we'll have a big venue, like 1,000 people. And could you bring 2 homies with you? And I say, sure. And if people ask, you know, and normally speaking, I pick, you know, 2 homies from rival gangs just to force them to share a hotel room, just to mess with them. And I always pick homies who have never flown before, just for the thrill of seeing gang members panicked in the sky. And years ago, I remember a homie said to me, hey, are we flying Virgin Airlines because it's our first time? I said, yes, it's a requirement. We'll be coming home on American. So I picked 2 homies, Larry, an African-American gang member, and a rival enemy of his, Mario. And I'm used to homies being kind of panicky and nervous. But Mario, I had nothing prepared me for Mario. He was it was starting to freak me out. He was actually hyperventilating, which I'd never seen before, you know. You know, and we hadn't even boarded the plane yet. So we get to Burbank Airport, which is smallish, but a big planes, you know, Southwest Airlines. And but they don't have that hermetically sealed chute, you know, to board the plane. You have to walk out onto the tarmac like you're the president, and you climb up the stairs that lead to the front of the plane. Big feature at Burbank, stairs that go to the back of the plane. So I'm sitting there with Mario, and Larry's out walking somewhere, and it's the first flight of the day, so it's really early. And our flight crew arrives, and I see 2 female flight attendants, both of them with very large cups of Starbucks coffee. And they're schlepping up the steps to board the plane. And Mario goes, when are we going to board the plane? I said, well, as soon as they sober up the pilots. There they go now. Perhaps I shouldn't have said that. I should tell you that Mario is the most tattooed individual who has ever worked at Homeboy. You know, he's all sleeved out to his fingertips. His neck is blackened with the name of his gang. head shaved, covered in tattoos, forehead, cheeks, chin, eyelids that say the end, so that, you know, when he's lying in his coffin, there will be no doubt. So I'd never been in public with him, and I thought, well, let's walk through the airport, thinking this might calm him down a little bit. And people, it was unbelievable. People were like this, and mothers are clutching their kids a little more closely, and I'm thinking, wow, you know, because if you were to go to Homeboy tomorrow, not tomorrow, Saturday, if you go on Monday, walk up to anybody and say, quick, who's the kindest, most gentle soul who works here? They'd think for a beat, and then they'd say, Mario. Yeah, Mario. Yes, so you met him, yes. So he's proof that only the soul that ventilates the world with tenderness has any chance of changing the world. He's proof that kindness is the only non-delusional response to everything. So we get to Gonzaga, and of course there's the big Tuesday night talk, but they don't tell you that they have 94 classes they'd like you to visit earlier in the day. And so I tell these guys, look, I'm going to mainly speak tonight, but you guys get up and talk. And so they do, and I sit in the back of the classroom, and their stories are of terror and torture and violence and abuse of every imaginable kind. And honest to God, if their stories had been flames, you'd have to keep your distance. Otherwise, you'd get scorched. I would not have survived a single day of their childhoods. So we get to the 1,000-person venue, and it's just packed with people. And I get the two of them up to speak before me, and Mario is quite terrified, but they both did a good job. And then I get up and I did my thing, and then I invited them to stand on either side of me, and started to field questions. And yes, ma'am, and a woman stands and she goes, yeah, I got a question, it's for Mario. First question out the gate. And Mario is a tall, skinny drink of water, and he clutches the microphone and he's trembling, and he says, yes. And she says, well, Mario, you say you're a father and you have a son and a daughter, they're about to enter their teenage years. What wisdom do you impart to them? You know, what advice do you give them? And Mario closes his eyes and he clutches the microphone even more intently, and he's getting a friggin' hernia trying to come up with whatever the hell he's going to say. And when suddenly he blurts out, as soon as he says those two words, he rushes back to his microphone-clutching, closed-eyed refuge. But he wants to get the entire sentence out. I just don't want my kids to turn out to be like me. And there's silence until the woman who asked the question stands, and now it's her turn to cry. Why wouldn't you want your kids to turn out to be like you? You are loving, you are kind, you are gentle, you are wise. I hope your kids turn out to be like you. And 1,000 total perfect strangers stand, and they will not stop clapping. And all Mario can do is hold his face in his hands, so overwhelmed that this room full of strangers had returned him to himself. And make no mistake that everybody standing had been returned to themselves. And suddenly kinship so quickly, no us and them, just us. And I think that's the only praise our exhausted God has any interest in. We take seriously what Jesus took seriously. We want to be the tender glance in the world because that's what we've received. We want to look at each other and say, "You're here. Oh, nobly born, you're here." And soon enough, we cease to care if anyone accuses us of wasting our time at the margins. For in this place of which you say it is a waste, there will be heard again the voice of mirth and the voice of gladness, the voices of those who sing.